All right, let's build something together. A user's guide to one of the oldest and most fundamental human questions out there. How do we decide what's right and what's wrong? This is ethics, and we're about to open up the toolkit that thinkers have been building for centuries to help us figure it all out.
You know, when you really boil it down, every tough choice you've ever had to make probably comes back to this one simple question. It sounds easy, right? But when the pressure's on, how do you actually decide what the right thing to do is? Well, the good news is we're not starting from scratch here. For literally thousands of years, some of the smartest people in history have been developing these frameworks, and I want you to think of them as different tools in a moral toolkit to help us navigate these tricky situations. So today, let's open that box up and see what's inside. So, first things first, we have to ask a really basic question. Is morality personal? Is it something defined by our culture? Or is it universal for everyone? This is all about figuring out where your moral compass even comes from in the first place. Okay, so our very first tool in the kit tackles this head on. It's called relativism. And it's basically the idea that there's no single, one-size-fits-all set of moral rules. It suggests that right and wrong aren't these fixed absolute things, but can actually change depending on who you are or where you're from. Now, what's interesting is that relativism kind of comes in two main flavors. On one hand, you've got subjective relativism. This is super personal. It's that classic line, what's right for you may not be right for me. But on the other hand, you have cultural relativism, which says, no, it's not about the individual. It's about the group. What's right is whatever your society or your culture says is right. And check this out. This is a perfect example of cultural relativism at work. Back in the 80s, there was this thing called the F2 epidemic among IT students. In that specific culture, sharing your programming code wasn't cheating. It was the norm. In fact, not sharing was seen as selfish. So in that little world, the entire idea of right and wrong was tied to the rules of that community. Okay, so if our culture can be our guide, what else is out there? Well, some frameworks look to a higher power for the answers. And then there are others that argue the only guide we really need is our own self-interest. So our next tool is called divine command theory. And it's pretty straightforward. The idea here is that something is good simply because God, or a higher power, says it is. See, morality isn't based on human reason or what the consequences might be. It's purely about obedience to that divine will. But the theory runs into a pretty big snag pretty quickly, the interpretation problem. You can have different groups of people looking at the exact same holy books and coming to completely opposite conclusions. I mean, just look at this. 3 different Christian denominations with 3 totally different moral rules about blood, all based on their interpretation of the same source. All right, let's switch gears completely. Now we have ethical egoism, and this one puts you at the absolute center of the moral universe. This philosophy says that the morally right thing to do is always whatever action provides the biggest long-term benefit to yourself. Now, this isn't necessarily about being greedy or mean, but it is, at its core, totally self-focused. And think about this very modern example. And come on, be honest. We've probably all done this. You're scrolling, and you like a friend's post, not because you're actually impressed, but because it's a strategic move. You know, you're investing in that social relationship, so they'll feel obligated to like your stuff later. That, right there, is a little everyday act of ethical egoism. Okay, this brings us to one of the biggest, oldest fights in all of ethics. What really matters more when you're making a tough call? Is it the rules you follow, or is it the results of what you do? You've definitely heard this phrase before, right? The end justifies the means. This is the perfect gateway to our next set of tools. It's the core idea that if you get a good enough outcome, well, it doesn't really matter how you got there. The morality is all about the final result. So that idea has a formal name, consequentialism. It argues that an action's morality is based entirely on its consequences. An action is good only if it produces good results. And the most famous version of this, you've probably heard of it, is utilitarianism, which aims for the greatest happiness for the greatest number. For a consequentialist, the outcome is absolutely everything. But what if the outcome isn't all that matters? The philosopher Immanuel Kant came along with a totally different take. He basically said, nope, some things are just right and some things are just wrong, period. And you have a duty to do the right thing no matter what happens next. So Kant's philosophy is called Kantianism, or sometimes deontology. And it's an ethics built purely on duty. It argues that certain moral rules are absolute. It's like you don't lie, not because you're scared of getting caught, but because lying itself is just wrong. The moral value isn't in the result, it's in your commitment to doing your duty.
The difference between these two becomes crystal clear when the stakes are really high. So, take a soldier in wartime. A Kantian could justify their actions by focusing purely on duty. I am following the orders I swore an oath to uphold. But a consequentialist would justify the exact same actions by pointing to the future outcome. This is necessary because it will lead to a greater peace. See that? Same action, totally different moral reasoning. All right, so we've just unpacked some of the most powerful and influential tools for making moral decisions. Let's lay them all out on the workbench and take a look at our completed toolkit. So, what have we got? We've got relativism, which says truth can be relative. There's divine command, where morality is all about obedience. We have ethical egoism, which focuses on self-interest. And then we have those two big rivals, consequentialism, saying the outcome is what matters, and Kantianism, arguing that no, it's your duty that really counts. And that really brings it all back to you, doesn't it? Each of these tools gives you a different way to look at a problem. None of them are perfect, but they're all part of this incredible human quest to figure out the right thing to do. So I guess the final question is, when you're facing a tough choice, which one of these tools do you reach for first, maybe without even realizing it?